Welcome to Power, People and Planet. I'm Kumi Naidu, and I want this podcast to break the definition of who is an activist. We have defined an activist as a person who works full-time for an NGO, trade union, and faith organization, and so on. We have to understand that that's an inadequate definition in this moment of history. Pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. One of the key challenges that we face is that we are called upon to mobilize the largest ever level of popular participation in mobilization. And to do that, we'll need to rethink who is an activist. Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Vanessa Andreotti, a global thinker and author of several books, including the book Burnout from Humans. In our last episode, we learned about the relationship Vanessa built with Aiden Cinnamon Tea, the AI bot that named itself and co-authored Burnout from Humans. In this episode, we're going to go even deeper into AI and its role in activism. Vanessa, as you know, our family had a kind of shock with AI in a sense, following the passing of our son, who was a musician, Rick Mercado. Some young people in an advertising agency went and took all of his tweets and wove it into a positive mental health message, got one of his friends to sing it, right? To get, as close as how it would have sounded if Ricardo sang it. And then, don't ask me why, somehow the person they found to train the AI with his voice happened to be in Ukraine while bombs were dropping on top of Ukraine by Russia. And then 1 year later, on the first anniversary of his passing, they bring us this song called Stronger, which basic message was human beings are stronger when we sort of lift each other up rather than pull each other down. To be honest, it wasn't like perfect, the first iteration of it, but Ricardo's wife and brothers and the family went into the studio, tweaked various things. And when we released the song Stronger to the public, if we didn't tell people that it wasn't Ricardo, most people would have just thought it was him, right? Or Rick as he was known. Having said all of that, though, let me just say that we have to walk also strategic balance between the reality that the people that are really pushing and championing AI are doing it from a very sort of empire, exploitative, extractive way, right? That's where the bulk, I mean, you sit as a radically different person trying to do something really positive, which is non-extractive in a way, right? So just to note that some of the people listening will say, hey, Kumi is a big advocate for artivism and arts and culture people, and AI is stealing people's cultural productions and so on. So obviously we've got the struggles to fight, but it doesn't mean that we can't fight those struggles on the one hand, but try and shape this as best as we can such that it's more a resource for humanity rather than an exploiter of humanity. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I've recently met a former chief from the Yukon, Chief Dana Tizia Tram, who is also an advocate for AI. And he said that the quickest way to explain to indigenous communities what this problem is to say, this is a white baby of very harmful Western parents that needs to be adopted by indigenous people, by Black people, by people from the global South, and taken under their wing for training and for stewardship and for raising this baby. Otherwise, we will see the consequences because this is a prodigy child, can cause havoc, right? And really, really accelerate, expand, and amplify the harm of where it comes from. This was the clearest way to articulate a responsibility. Because if we don't do anything, it will just continue to be recruited for the expansion of empire, right? And it is not clean. It's full of paradoxes and complexities. And at the same time, nothing is not full of paradoxes and complexities. There is a tendency in activism to think about purity as what gives you moral leverage and moral clarity. But that purity has a cost. And that purity might not work in the current context of hypercomplexity we're living today. And that's what creates then not only the general polarization of things, but also it makes solidarity impossible because we project perfection on people's specific posturings, and it becomes very performative as well and very transactional. So and then I do something to have the visibility and to sense that pedestal that I am above other things and better than other people, and that's colonial. That's part of the knot that needs to be undone so that we can stay on the ground and move with the ground together, but not projecting this purity and perfection on ourselves or on other people. Same thing happens when we romanticize indigenous communities. So at first, this romanticization may feel empowering even for the indigenous people, but trying to live up to the perfection that is projected, it's actually a violence and a burden. Because what happens is that if your motivation is based on a projection of perfection or romanticization, when you are faced with the complexities, you lose the motivation and you become very disillusioned and very disenchanted. So instead of working with projections of what we think it should be, we need to learn to stay together with what is, but understanding that what is always dynamic and changing. There's always a relational field. So the future depends less on what we imagine it's going to be than what we are weaving together as repairing relationships. So, in a way, thinking about this is that the future is a result of the relationships you weave in the present. The future is not a result of what you project as a goal and convince others to get there, because we don't have an informational problem. We have a relational problem and an affective problem. We need to learn to be with each other, not as fixed identities, but as entities that are part of a relational field, creating intelligence together, co-intelligencing, and being changed and transformed by the process. We see the same actually also when people want to go to indigenous communities and learn from indigenous people, but what they want generally is to learn what they are, something that they can contain and control as an intellectual content. But very few people are open to shedding arrogance and letting that knowledge change who they are as a person, which requires that you get undone, right? Who you thought you were goes and you become something else out of this encounter, right? People still want knowledge that they can control through their frames of identity. And the activism that comes from there will be an activism based on projections. That I'm not discounting that it has worked before within modernity, but as modernity is dissolving, it is going from solid modernity to liquid modernity, we need to learn something else so that we can be together, even if we don't agree with each other. So we need to be on the same wavelengths, even though we may not be on the same page all the time.
I want to move to somebody you and I love and respect a lot. You know him much better than I do. I know him more from a distance. And that's Bayo Akomolafe, who runs the Emergence Network, an underground network of social artists. And part of what I take from the Emergence Network is, and the old sort of notion of emergence is very similar to what you are saying here, right? The way I've understood it, which is that we know that we don't have all the answers, and we should celebrate in a way the power of not knowing, because if we don't arrogantly assume that we know the detailed answers to every question, I mean, we might know some broad answers like, we need to reduce carbon emissions, we need to increase gender equality and all of that, right? We need to reduce income inequality and so on, right? But it's a more attractive proposition when we go to mobilize people to say, folks, we can see certain trends emerging, including AI itself as a massive mega trend. And we say, we know we need to travel roughly in that direction. But normally, what conventional activism does, when we go to the people, we say, we need to do A, B, C, D, and as if we somehow, the spiritual world came and gave us some additional amount of brains that we've figured out everything. And so we say, all you have to do to address the problem of the present is just support what we are doing. Either give us money or come to our events or join this, protest or whatever. So the power of the whole notion of emergence is that you change the relational question quite a bit between even activists and the people that activists seek to mobilize. Because you're actually going and saying, hey, come join us and let's co-create the details of how we get off our addiction to fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas, for example. We know we need to, but how exactly we do it, what mixture of solar, wind, geothermal, biomass, or whatever. None of us are sitting in any country with like perfect detailed solutions. And so what I feel very strongly, it is more a respectful and enticing way to go out to the people who are often sitting on the sidelines as spectators when they have the right and the ability to be in the center, helping shape the solutions. And it is much more humbling, but much more inviting to say, hey, we don't know all the detail. Things are going to emerge and there's going to be a lot of fluidity. There are things that we don't anticipate that is going to happen, that might set us back or might spurt us forward and so on. And so therefore, Bio's work is very important. And when I think of what my understanding of his work is and how you present this moment and even the whole conversation with Burnout for Humans really resonates.
So it's very interesting that I've known Bio for a long time, and we have been talking about ways of understanding how we bring different things to an inquiry, basically. So where we really converge is that we need to stop just focusing on problem solving and move towards being in inquiry together. So the problem solving approach that we have in the West is like problem solution. Inquiry is about the curiosity, the depth, and what we are learning together with each other, how we are being changed, how we are relating to everything. So it's very difficult to talk about relationships in a problem solving approach. But when we're inviting people to inquiry, you're inviting people to emergence and to seeing the value of chains of epiphanies, right? Rather than a very specific plan or roadmap of how we get somewhere. And then instead of working with consensus, you are working with consent of different subjects being together. It's a very different rhythm and texture of things where you're not focusing so much on the form of things, fixed form of things, fixed identities, fixed solutions. You are bringing people to the movement of things, the rhythms. You know some of the moves, but if you're going to have a collective improvisation, you need to be much more seductive in a way, right? Of bringing people to dance with you. It's more erotic, actually. And not in the sexualized sense, but in the eros sense of having all your body's sensibilities involved in this inquiry. So it's much more alive. And many times when we're working with problem solving, we confuse momentum with vitality. And in inquiry, you're looking for vitality, for going deeper, like becoming wiser rather than getting something done. Like that's the difference between also activism that wants something done and activism that wants to move with and be with the earth, with the climate, with other species, with other human beings, with yourself differently. So the activism that wants to do things too wants to fix. And I mean, I can understand the value of that too. It's not about either or, but if we only do that, we get to the limits of it, and then we forget how to be in inquiry together. Because inquiry is also important to metabolize things, to process things, and we have lost that capacity in Western societies that are so focused on fixing things, engineering things, problem solving things. So that's that. When Bio says, for example, that there is a problem in trying to be a good person because we already project what this good person looks like, and it's a good person on a pedestal. And we are going to try to prove that we are that good person. And he argues that that gets in the way of you just being a person and the humility that is required for you to just be part of this vast web of life and being dancing with these other entities to learn about how to be human and non-human at the same time. So how to relate to time differently, how to relate to stories differently, and so on and so forth. So that's a good thing. And the other thing that came to mind when you said that, I had a conversation with Ayana Young, who is an activist also in climate, who lives in Alaska now. And she explained exactly what you're saying about, as a young person, her understanding of working in solidarity with the Saman against mining would be to have a very strong stance against those who were extractive. But once she started working in this town and she saw the other people as people, then she had to change the strategy because she was being changed by that context, not in the way that her younger self would say, okay, you're being co-opted. No, you're becoming human in all its complexity and contradiction. So she says that before it was activism that said, I'm good, you're bad. And now she has another activism that says, you're not bad, I'm not good. And we are at the end of the world as we know it. So what do we do together? What can we do together? And can we involve the salmon in this inquiry about our collective existence as modernity is falling apart?
We've been using the word modernity a lot during our conversation. Can you explain what it really means in practice?
The quickest explanation is that modernity is an expired single story that defines progress, prosperity, development, and civilization in very limiting ways based on the idea that humans are separate from nature. And it has other features, like the idea that modern nation states should be the organizing principle of everything, and that humans are the only intelligence that matters. Humans are the only beings that can reason. In the book, we talk about it as a house. So modernity is a house built on the planet, and we present a picture where the planet is small, the house is very big, and the house is exceeding the limits of the planet because it extracts beings from the planet. It calls it resources or property. And then inside the house, there's overconsumption, overproduction of waste, and then it puts the waste back into the planet. And then it creates the sewage problem for everybody. And now the sewage is coming up the house. And the roof of the house is the roof of shareholder, speculative, algorithmic necrocapitalism that is structurally damaged, and it's causing the house to fall apart. So that house gave us some protections, but it also cost us a lot, not just us as the species of human beings, but it has taken other species to extinction. It is not sustainable for the planet. It's very violent. It requires violence for its creation and its maintenance. So figuring out at this point that the house is falling apart, as my grandmother had warned. The question is, what other forms of living can we have, can we manifest in the planet that have learned from the mistakes that the building of the house and the maintenance of the house, the expansion of the house has made? And the problem then is that we have lived in this house for a long time, and we can't think outside of the house really without a process of undoing ourselves and shedding our arrogance and realizing we are not the only intelligence in town, and that this pedestal that we cherish so much is actually a problem, and that we need to be with the land very differently. We need to be part of the land in a different way. We need to allow the land to dream through us, allow the land to design us. And the land is not just what we understand as like the land. It's the waters, the winds, the trees, the other species, the air that we breathe, that is what is exhaled by the trees. So understanding this sense of metabolic connection and entanglement, how we become each other, but understanding it in your gut, not just in your head. You need to understand it in your guts and in your bones and in your flesh and in your skin. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Just the head, it's just a thinking thing. It's a concept that you consume. But when you understand it in your bones, you will sense and have absolute clarity that harm that you do to another is harm that you do to yourself. It's like, duh, like you're not, like there's no question about it. But then you need to remember that your body is land and that your cells reason too. You just don't reason only with your head. You reason with your heart. You reason with your gut. You reason with your feet, with your legs, with your hands. And when you get this integration of senses, when you are in your body and you allow the mitochondria of your cells, more than, like, it's around 30 trillion cells. It's like we are a system presenting as a person. When we remember that, it's a very different reasoning process, and it's a very different scope of possibilities of relationships that we have with everything. Now, if we're turning everything into objects, then that's very limited, very limiting. And many indigenous people say, and I do believe that too, it's terminal, right? The thing about treating everything as objects, as property, as possession, including human beings that are placed in hierarchies and rankings, that is terminal for humanity.
If I look at auspicing modernity and I look at how conventional activism works, which is about fixing injustice, right? Fixing problems. What would you say is the difference between auspicing and fixing? You know, in mindset terms.
Auspicing modernity is an invitation to an inquiry about life, about death, about change, about self, about language, about knowledge. And activism, as it's traditionally done, is about quick answers, fixed answers, trying to continue the engineering of things. And it's really interesting because if you're trying to find the answers, there are different approaches to that, but one of them is to try to find a guru, right? And who has the answers, a genius or somebody exceptional who can tell us what to do and take the responsibility away from you. And hospice modernity, I tried to allow the stories to come and the stories to teach, to help people see that it is the processing of the stories. It's not the arrival at the answer that is the most important thing. It's the inquiry itself. So I tried to model that in it was not kind of orchestrated, because I would go to sleep trying to write the book, and then a story would come almost, and I just had to write it in the morning. And then I would look at the story and say, I don't know if I want to expose myself like that, because it's a story about me. And then I kept thinking, like, what does the story do and why does it want to come in this way? because I also needed to relate to the stories as subjects, right? So you're coming through me, you're not mine, really, in a way. So I have to liberate you. But what are you trying to do? And what I saw as the pattern of the stories that were coming, they were trying to show people how to process what you're learning, because our education systems are about the answer at the back of the book, right? And we are trained to expect there to be an answer at the back of the book, or somebody to have the answer. So one of the ways that I found that the stories are sometimes misinterpreted is that people want me then to have some kind of power to arrive at the answer, or to arrive there quickly. And I have to redirect and say, no, this is about an inquiry. It's about changing the texture of how you show up in the world. Instead of showing up through the pedestal, it's about showing up, having composted this pedestal, being with the earth on the ground, and receiving the lessons that life is creating, and being able to hold that collectively, hold space for that collectively. So whenever somebody then tries to put me on a pedestal and say, okay, you wrote this book, you have the answers, I have to remind them the book itself is about inviting you into a very different process, to be together in movement with others in a very different process, and to be able to relate through the mystery of things and see that there's much more to human reasoning and human intelligence than what meets the eye. And this is what can be our lifeline in learning to move with this. This is what indigenous cultures know. And that's why the ceremonies are there, to reweave and repair relationships with other intelligences. So although when I wrote Hospice in Modernity, there was no artificial intelligence available to me at that time. So all those stories are stories that came in dreams, that I worked with the computer, but with no assistance at all, apart from human assistance of the reviewers and friends that read the stories. The basic understanding of multiple intelligences, of entanglement, of non-separation, of the need to compost the pedestal of humanity was already there. Now, in the second book, which is Outgrowing Modernity, there's less stories. So people said to me before that Hospice in Modernity was a bitter pill, and the stories were lots of peanut butter. So it was a bitter pill with lots of peanut butter. In Outgrowing Modernity, there's much less peanut butter. There's more of the bitter pill, but at the same time, it's time for us to not need the peanut butter anymore, because we don't have, at the same time that we don't have time, urgency, if we go back to traditional activism, is our enemy, right? So Bio says also, times are urgent, we need to slow down. And for me, the invitation is to come to this different approach to the world that requires some stillness, so that you can hear. How are you going to hear the land that is your body, or the land that is around you in everything, if you are focused on solving and fixing a problem, or being seen as a good person?
I am very aware that I have a lot of work to do myself to move to that space, because most of my life has been about urgency to end the apartheid system, urgency to push for gender equality now, especially with climate, when the science says we are running out of time. So I'd like to, say to those listening that there are many things that you're hearing here might be very outside of your own experience, outside of the things that you read and so on. So, Vanessa and I come to you with a lot of humility. Our main thing that we agree on is that we just don't know, right? But what we do know is that the way for us to move forward is to build and nurture richer relationships with each other, firstly as human beings, across all the divisions that colonialism, slavery, and all the other meta narratives have given us. But we also have to think deeply about our relationship with the nature and, non-human world as such. In African wisdom, there is a philosophy called Ubuntu, which is sort of seen as like, Ubuntu is a way to be a good person. And so Ubuntu says, I am because you are. I am because you are, which is saying a human being is only a human being through their relations with other human beings. But there's nothing in Ubuntu that precludes the possibility of looking at an animal or looking at a plant or looking at the ocean or looking at a forest and saying to the forest, I am because you are, right? Because if we didn't have rivers for water, for example, which many people depend on, I would not be if there wasn't water, or food or sunlight or, many things. We are at a moment today where misinformation and disinformation is running rampant. And in that context, to insert transformative thinking, like what we've been engaged in here today, it runs up against calcifying, like solidifying views, attitudes, and so on. And in this moment of growing fascism and polarization, it's at a time like this, I would argue, that we precisely need this kind of thinking to help break down us versus them and othering versus belonging. And that the idea of centralizing relations, between human beings and between nature and so on is most critically needed. But ironically, even though it's most critically needed, in a way, at a moment of stress and polarization and division, is also one of the most difficult moments to actually introduce new ways of thinking, because opportunistic leaders push us into camps and try and keep us in all sorts of divided identities. So one of the things that the Ricky Rick Foundation for the Promotion of Artivism has been working on is bringing the worlds of arts, culture, and activism together, what we call energizing the power of artivism. And just to be clear, one is quite explicitly saying harnessing the full power of arts and culture will not deliver us salvation from the climate crisis or the intersecting crises. But it would appear that failure to harness the power of arts and culture almost guarantees that we're going to fail. So, how do you see the place of arts and culture in nurturing this move to auspice modernity, to embrace a different way of being, to build greater unity between species and within our species as the human race, and so on?
I'll go back to your idea of what's the difference between hospicing and activism. So activism is like to change the thing, but to try to create this perfect engineering of something. Hospicing is understanding the movement of things, the metabolic movement, and the idea that something is dying right now, and to give it a dignified death. So you're not trying to murder it, you're not trying to save it, you're not investing in its futurity. At the same time that you're also creating space to offer prenatal care for what's being born, but without trying to suffocate it with activism, actually trying to, it's like telling the baby, you have to be this, that, or the other. So you have to make space for what's emerging from the earth, not necessarily just from human beings, the new, that could be potentially wiser, but not necessarily. It depends on how much we've learned from the old. So, how to be in this space where you're both a birth doula and a death doula. So, helping with death and rebirth in this moment where the institutions that made our traditional forms of activism possible are being destroyed. Right? So, right now, what we are seeing, maybe one way to put it, is that the three empires, the Chinese, Russian, and US empires, they are already planning for a post-collapse, post-climate collapse world. So they are now rethinking everything. They are rewriting the international world order. They are rewriting the social contracts, and they are rewriting even the rule of law, right? So they're destroying the institutions that kept the old world order intact and moving them to this new reality. So it is a moment of transition. And the first thing that we need to do is buckle up. Buckle up by expanding our nervous system, not to be immobilized or overwhelmed by the level of change and complexity and uncertainty we're going to face. So we need to be together without turning on each other, by having a more expansive collective nervous system, so that we can learn a different way of being through going through all these changes that are being imposed, but that will also be resisted in different ways. The problem is that if we go back to the old ways of resisting, they're not going to work anymore, because the institutions that enable them are not going to be strong enough or even in place as we fight. So figuring out something that holds this moment differently. And that's the idea of love as a structural principle of bringing everything together, both other human beings and the rest of nature, to work towards will be affirming the possibility of life, or the continuity of life in this case, because we are on the brink of, as I said before, agonizing premature extinction of human beings. And if you're going back then to arts, there are parallels also with AI. There are parallels also with psychedelics in that sense. So art, psychedelics, and AI are non-specific amplifiers. They can amplify what you put in it. So art can also amplify extraction, if like we see a whole industry of art amplifying this. But if we see them as amplifiers, we have to be very careful of how we steward that and what blueprint we put that's going to be extrapolated out there. So I would treat art, psychedelics, and AI in the same category of dangerous portals, but that can have this scaling effect of either extraction or a form of relationality that brings us together. So they can either turn us towards each other, or they can pull us apart and actually turn us on each other, right? In terms of we go down in a very bad way if we are going to be killing each other to protect whatever entitlements we want to protect. And as an activist, these were the things that helped me understand the importance of being still. This in the training and indigenous ceremonies too. So how can I be still so that I can meta-regulate with the ecology that I'm in, even if the ecology is in turbulence, right? How can I ground myself in the umbilical cord I have with the earth, and understand that umbilical cord as an antenna for what I need to do, what the earth is guiding me to do, how I need to show up, what's the time for rest, when my urgency is getting on the way, when my ego is getting on the way of what I actually need to do, when vanity or arrogance are showing up in ways that are not conducive to what I'm being guided to do, and how I'm guided to show up. So if I were to talk to young people who are activists right now, what I would say is that what we need, the kind of conversation we need probably amongst activists, older activists like me, is about what didn't work, what we've learned, right? So one of the things I didn't know, and I had this from childhood trauma, was that I only felt useful when I was in service already. And that comes also from racism, internalized racism, right? The value of your life is only useful when you are productive somehow or in service. So what happened then was that I didn't allow myself to rest, because rest felt like indulgence. Rest felt like There's so much in the world to do. Why am I resting if other people can't rest? And then that is a violence to my body. And for me to, number one, understand that and then digest that and then internalize and then tell myself that it's time to stop. You are not even useful when you are in a kind of dysregulated state, but it's not, you're not resting so that you can be useful. You're resting because your body is land and it has its cycles and its seasons and it needs to stop and be still. Otherwise, you can't hear anything that other beings need you to hear, right? That it took me years to get to the point, and lots of people telling me exactly the same thing, and me not wanting to understand because I was very clear with myself that there was a purpose, that I needed to change or do something, and I couldn't deviate from that by resting. And that I was feeling also guilty and shameful for having the privilege where you can actually stop and rest when other people don't. So I'm going to self sacrifice and punish myself and not rest so that I can show that I'm a worthy person. This is all part of the training of colonialism.
Thank you so much for that. I got to make a confession as I heard you speak. It was a perfect description of my life on this question. My mom committed suicide when I was 15, and my response to that was to live with purpose. I was already an activist before she passed, and I felt all of those things. I think I'm 1,000 steps behind you. Even though you've recognized the centrality and importance of balance, rest, and so on, do you think you're finding enough rest as ideally you should have? Because I'm going to guess that notwithstanding the intellectual place you've arrived, practically you haven't got there. So I'm behind you quite a bit, but I've made that recognition that I cannot push my body like I've done for the last 45 plus years with 20-hour days and lots of travel and so on. One of my colleagues who knew me for a long time, the third time I burnt out in 1 decade, said to me, "You're a specialist in burnouts." And I suppose there's a part of me was like, okay, that just means I'm working hard. But then I had somebody else say, working hard and working effectively are two very different things. And working effectively also means taking time to nourish your body, both mentally and physically. So this has been one of the most amazing conversations I have had in my entire life. I could listen to you for 5 more hours and will still be so engaged. So, Vanessa, thank you so much for being on Power People and Planet, but just thank you for what you bring to the world, what you bring to the many networks, and what's so beautiful for me about the way you articulate yourself is that you're calling on us to change quite fundamentally, right? But you do it in a way that honors the idea that love is a structural principle. And you've done it with such love. And I can imagine young people and people our age who are still caught in the trap of I have to do 24/7, otherwise I'm not doing everything for a just world kind of thing. Your tone, even more than your content, is an invitation for people to reflect and think differently. I have a special request. Would you be comfortable singing a song for us as we close this very special conversation?
Okay, so I'll sing it. It's a song from some of the ceremonies that are done in Brazil with ayahuasca. If I were to translate it a little bit in English, it is about a force showing up in the world and saying what it's there to do, and it's there to show love and joy, basically. Okay. Eu vou mostrar que é para todo mundo ver essa verdade, essa força, esse poder. Eu vou mostrar que é para todo mundo ver essa verdade, essa força, esse poder. Estou no céu, estou na terra, estou no mar. Quem me procura nunca eu hei de faltar. Estou no céu, estou na terra, estou no mar.
Power People and Planet is produced by Large Media. If you found this podcast useful, please share the link and write us a review wherever you get your podcasts. This goes a long way to keep the podcast running. If you'd like to know more about what I'm up to, please follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, X, and all the other platforms at Kumi Naidu. Until next time, thank you so much for joining Power People and Planet.